I remember about 10 years ago, people start talking about G2, meaning US and China. And I told people at the time, I said, China would never accept G2. China prefer a multilateral approach. They don't want to stick out their head, become the other G together with G1, which is the US. But I don't hear people talk about G3 except in Europe. Of course, the G3 meaning EU. How do you see the world in this dimension? Is it a G2 world? Will there be a G3 world? Or will it be a G1 world? What is the world going to look like as we see it evolve?
As everyone here, I've noticed that President Trump, during just after the meeting he had and prior to the meeting he had with President Xi Jinping, pronounced the word G2. And I remember it was during the time I was in China. I remember the Chinese officials we are talking to rejecting this idea of a G2. G2 means harsh competition, and G2 it means a tête-à-tête which is never, I would say, pleasant. I have another example at the European level, which is not of a G2, but which is a tête-à-tête between France and Germany. My experience of the tête-à-tête between two countries is that it's always frustrating, it's always insufficient, and we need a sort of broker between us, someone else. That's why the Brexit was a tragedy, because when you had the British in the EU, you had the French and the Germans, and always when something went wrong, one of the two was always managing some solution with the third party. And that's where the British were very useful, or it was Britain, Germany, and we were managing something with them. So when I hear this idea of the G2, it means harsh competition between the US and China, which in my view exists in a way regarding this competition for key technologies, because key technologies will structure the world of tomorrow, not because one or the other will be producing more, but the one who will, I wouldn't say win, the one who will be the first will have his own technology, having norms and standards imposed on all the regions where they will propagate these technologies. And so that's where the competition between the US and China takes place. And here, precisely, the tête-à-tête between China and the US is, I wouldn't say dangerous, but can be very rough. And that is precisely where one needs a third party. And the third party, as you said, could be the EU, should be the EU. Should be the EU because of the size, because of the weight, because of the I have to say the capability of the EU for a right balance of the world. And it's now up to the EU to find out the right place. If you allow me, I could say a bit more about it.
Please.
Because as long as we had, I would say, a happy globalization, there were no issues between all these big ensemble. China had its own development, I would say nourished by the Americans and by the trade with America, by the exchange of students and all that, by some R&D, and there was no, in the eyes of the Americans, no danger for the American hegemony. The EU had very happy moments with China since the first agreements we had in 75, then in 86, then the support given by the EU to China in 2001. You remember in the WTO, World Trade Organization. Then 2008, let's remember the support given by China through investments during the financial crisis. Then it started to become more complicated. I think 2009, 2008 was the beginning of a waking up by the countries, by the emerging countries. Let's call them like that. And let's remember that the BRIC at the time, because the South Africans joined a bit later, they were founded. they started in 2009, which was the first time emerging countries thought, oh my God, should we follow this Western model which can derail, which has derailed already once, which was the war in Iraq, actually. The hubris of the Americans, they wanted, after the fall of the USSR, to impose democracy everywhere. And as President Chirac, whom I served for 5 years, was saying, if democracy is not accepted, we shall bring it in armored vehicles. And that's what happened.
Did Chirac say it or America say it?
Chirac did.
Chirac
said that. Said that, and it was not the proper way of having a democracy. And we know the result of this Iraq war. 2008, these were the subprime crisis. I was in London at the time, I remember. A sort of hubris as well. So everything is possible, the bonus are there, no limits. And 2008, the beginning. And so there was a reaction. And at that moment, I remember I was in China in 2016. That was the big issue of China acceding to the market economy status. And we were all discussing about it, and there was a big debate within the EU, should we accept it or not? Is China a developed country? Is China not a developed country? It was both. And China was practicing dumping, in particular in steel. And so the decision was taken, let's China, I would say, stick to its commitments regarding no dumping policies, and let's postpone the idea of having China in this status of a market economy. So that was the beginning of a frowning, in a way, between China and the European Union. Then there was this idea of 2019. You remember the big visit, tremendous visit of President Xi Jinping to Paris, received by Mrs. Merkel, President Juncker of the Commission. So these were glorious times when thought at the time we have a concept, partner, competitor, and systemic rival. I think the concept was not well understood in China, which saw that as a sort of, I would say, reluctance to go ahead with China. That's how I felt it. But it was still a success because we were considering the rise of China and the fact that Mrs. Merkel herself came from Berlin to Paris, that the President of the Commission came to Paris. That was a sort of tribute paid to China. Yes, we recognize the importance of China in this general, I would say, evolution of the world. It's important to have the perspective. That's why I am just reminding all these events. Then we had the COVID crisis. And the COVID crisis was a major break because it prevented us from going further. We had to restart, to bounce back on the crisis which had affected us, which had affected China, which had affected the US. It was a new start, in a way. And we had the war in Ukraine. And the war in Ukraine, the aggression by the Russians, a violation of the Charter, and at this moment, the fractures of the world which we had observed for the last 10 years took some consistency, in a way. Because at that moment, one saw, with all the votes at the UN in the early 2022, after the Russians invaded Ukraine, we saw that 40 to 60 countries at the UN refused to condemn, but all abstained or were not in the room during the vote, which is the easiest way of not participating. And it was a surprise. It was a surprise, and then this surprise crystallized because we decided to have sanctions on Russia. And we tried to convince the rest of the world, and in fact, we convinced no one. We convinced always the OECD countries. There are only 34 countries who are imposing sanctions on Russia. Now 20 packages, which shows that it is a difficult matter. Russia, the war is still on. Very soon it will be 4 years. And so we saw this fracturing. And China, we insisted on having China condemning Russia. Here, I have my personal views. I think we have
retired diplomat.
We have put. I am no longer active. Madam Consul General, I am no longer active. I am a free man now. So I have no instructions. We have put this elephant, Ukraine, in the middle of the road for having a closer relationship between the EU and China. Why did I remind all the steps which we had with China, the EU with China? Because it worked very well. We had common interests. But now we have Ukraine. And we say, by every meeting with the Chinese, do condemn. Can we force China to condemn? Of course not. But will China condemn? Of course not. Because you cannot condemn your major neighbor. You cannot condemn a country on which you depend on your energy, which is vital for your very existence, which is existential. And so, as long as we shall do that, it will be very complicated. We start with this first thing. Instead, I think now the story between China and the EU is a story of missed opportunities. Missed opportunities. Why? Because we are attending a global change of on the international stage. A global change for many reasons, in particular the fact that emerging countries are organizing themselves, that China has taken a lead. This morning we had a discussion about the international monetary system. My conviction is that what China, but in France and in Europe it's not well understood, what has, I would say, hit the most the international relations are sanctions by the Americans. The extraterritoriality of sanctions is something, through the dollar, through the transactions in dollar, is something which has hit, I would say, the whole of the international community. I made the experience myself. When I was a Secretary General, it was the time President Trump unplugged the agreement, the JCPOA, the General Agreement on nuclear with Iran. So no more agreement. So the Iranians came to us and said, but what will you do? And so all the French companies were threatened if they continue to think of investments in Iran, to which we had against a renunciation on sovereignty regarding the nuclear. We had promised $40 billion of investments. The Iranians were telling us, will you invest? And so all the companies were saying, the French companies, no, we shall not invest because we should be deprived of investing in the US, and we need the US as a market. So the threat by the US made all this agreement totally fall apart. We decided to invent a barter system which was called Instex. The French, the British, and the Germans, we decided. I was the French representative in this device, which was supposed to gather sufficient funds to make the Iranians able to export their oil. And which was the major thing, the major purpose of the agreement for them. And there was never enough money in the fund. It was a sort of barter system. And the Iranians, I remember the vice minister, who is now the minister for foreign affairs in Iran, telling me, do you want us to export pistachio and carpets, or do you want to export our oil? And so, because everyone was threatened by the sanctions, and the ones who were not respecting the US extraterritorial jurisdiction would be deprived of their capabilities on the American market. Plus, they will be accused of threatening the American security, which was the case for the ones in Instex. So, we are in a situation where everyone in the world, every country has experienced this idea that, yes, we can be sanctioned. Do you know that there are about more than 50 countries in the world which are under sanctions? From Cuba, 1962, until Russia, over too many, and so many countries. Sometimes
50, did you say?
50, about 50 countries.
That's 1/4 of the world's
Yes,
United Nations member
absolutely.
almost.
And so everyone is fearing that they would be imposed sanctions. Hence, China taking a lead, which we should take into consideration, because China not only takes the lead, but China has about 100 countries and is the first trading partner of about 100 countries. So it's a natural leadership for China. And in between, we have put Ukraine in the middle. At the moment, we should try to find out the ways and means to work with China, with those countries, with those new regions. I am always very, I would say, cautious and vigilant on a new development, which are all these preferential tariff zones, RCEP, for instance, Regional Cooperation and Economic Partnership, which had its first summit RCEP, yes, which has its first summit in Malaysia just recently with the APEC summit. So these are huge ensemble. CPTPP as well, without China, but the British are very clever. They've joined the CPTPP. Why is not the EU with China to work with China in these zones? In fact, now if we want to sum up I would say the difficulties for which the EU has to find out a strategy out of three difficulties. First difficulty, we want to decouple from Russian energy because most of the sanctions are against Russia and imposing a cutoff of supply of oil and gas in the EU first, with a tremendous effects on Germany in particular, but the rest of the EU as well. Second, we want to be independent of the US because in between there is this Trump, the elections of President Trump for a second mandate, and we are not sure about security. And half of Europe is relying on the US. And third, we want to de-risk from China. So it's difficult. These are the three major objectives we have, which are in fact negative objectives in a way, because to de-risk, to decouple, and to be independent, which means, are we alone? No, we are not alone. We are in a globalized world. We have supply chains, we have value chains in which we depend on each other. So these are the major stakes which we have to deal with, which are challenges. How can we manage these challenges? This is the big question mark.
Then I want to bring you to what happened. I think it was yesterday that you were in a session on the Family Business Summit together with the President Ambassador of EU to Beijing. And I was totally flabbergasted when your ambassador, not France, but EU, said that China must condemn Russia because this is existential threat to Europe. My question to him this morning was this, and you were there. My question to him was, China's existential threat, number one, is energy security. And still so much of the oil and natural gas come through the Malacca Strait that if the Seventh Fleet of the United States were to blockade the Malacca Strait within weeks, China will be on its knees. And so energy security is existential to China. So how can the EU explain to me? I fail to understand. How can the EU ambassador say, it is existential threat to me, so you should kill yourself, China, and condemn Russia? And Russia is the closest supply of the pipeline and so forth of energy to China. In case the sea link is blocked, Russia is the only one that China really can rely on. And so it's existential to China. So how come EU today is so self-centered that because of my existential threat, you have to kill yourself, China, to support us? Now, that's a bad part. The good part is this. We just spent a couple of days in Paris, and I noticed that the business community are now more open than last year and certainly more open than 2 years ago to finally invest or at least approach China for economic relationship, which was not there a few years ago. So the private sector is already leading the charge. But your your EU ambassador is, to me, so ridiculous. Now, will the politics follow economics, or will politics choke the economics and make you again desegregate from China?
First of all, security, energy security is a key thing for every country, and for the EU as well as for China. We need energy. We have some, of course, renewables. We have nuclear energy regarding France, but we have also in our mix a lot of fossil energy. And so in certain countries still the coal is exploited. In France no longer, but we need oil and gas imported because we don't have it. But no, actually there are two kinds of, there is security, energy security, but there is the issue of Ukraine. It is also existential to us, and that's why when I talk about when I say that we have an elephant in the room, which is Ukraine, which is a barrier which obstructs the roads between the EU and China, it's why maybe we should take the thing by another way. It's existential on a security point of view. And there are concepts which have existed in the past, which have totally lost of sight nowadays, which are the concept of pacific coexistence. We can live together without being too close to each other, but I would say admitting that the other can still exist. So pacific coexistence and collective security. In my view, this is one of the ways which could be, I would say, followed to one of the paths which could be followed to find out a solution to Ukraine. And this is the issue of the guarantees of security, which has been, I would say, raised during Trump and Putin's meeting, the first meeting in Anchorage. The issue was there, and this meeting in Budapest, which didn't take place, but this was also on the table. Guarantees of security, which involves the rest of the world. Collective security is not only now for, as it was during the Cold War, between the US and USSR of the time and Russia of now. It should involve every country. After Anchorage, there were many meetings. There was a meeting of the Europeans, and the Europeans have set up a coalition of the willings, which should send troops not too close to the front line, which would be frozen for a while. So plenty of ideas, but actually immediately rejected by the Russians, who said, these are NATO countries. We will never accept any NATO soldier on the Ukrainian soil. So the Ukrainians would like to have some support, and we saw a statement made by Lavrov. I am not here the spokesman of Lavrov, but
Foreign Minister
of Russia. Of course not. But I think we should look closer to what has been said, because it's not so far away of our own thought. Lavrov mentioned the idea of having guarantees of security exerted by the P5, plus Germany, plus Turkey, and others, which means that it's open. When he says the P5, these are the permanent members of the Security Council, which are the US, which is Russia, which is France and Britain, but as well China. China is involved in a settlement of the crisis, they want it or not. That's something which seems to me very clear for the future. And if I'm not wrong, there were two missions of a special envoy by Beijing, Ambassador Li Hui, who came to Europe last year, who came to Moscow and Kiev, and met with counterparts with a 12-point plan in which there are some principles of the Charter of the UN which are reminded, non-aggression, respect of the integrity of borders, respect of sovereignty and all that, on which we agree. There is no recognition of the annexation of territories by Russia on Ukraine. So there is a sort of common ground. So what I wouldn't say this is the solution. What I would say is we should, from our side, find out the ways and means to propose something which is more common ground with a major country like China, which could not be a broker, but impose its own idea and contribute to the solution. It's a matter of finding out the contributors. And so here we are, because it's true that Ukraine issue is existential to the Western Europe. It's existential to the eastern part of Europe because they have been occupied by the Soviet Union in the past, and so they keep the memory, and it's very important. Memory of the countries are so important. I remember when I was in London, just a little anecdote to illustrate what I mean by this idea of memory. I was in London and I met Professor Julian Jackson. I presented him an award of the French Republic, and he's a professor of history at Cambridge. And he had written a book which was called The Fall of Europe, which is 1940, when there was no more Europe except the British. And I told him and he wrote a lot about the resistance in France, resistance in Italy, and in many countries of Europe against the Nazi occupation. And I told him, is it interesting for the British to read something about the resistance? And he told me, yes, of course. Because Britain is the only country in that part of the world which was never occupied. Since William the Conqueror in 1066, they don't know what is to live below the boots of a foreign occupier.
Interesting.
And so I found it very interesting because every country has its own collective emotional memory. That's how he calls it, Professor Julian Jackson. The Chinese have their collective emotional memory. The 100 years of humiliation, this is a collective emotional memory. Every folk, every country, let's think, what is the collective emotional memory of the French? It is, of course, the French Revolution. It took us about 1 year to swallow and digest it, with the great laws on democracy and the communes and the freedom of the press and all that. One century to swallow it. Then we had the First World War, and we had the Second World War when we were beaten by the Germans, where we were defeated. The 25th of June 1940 is the saddest day of the French history. There was no more France. The Germans occupied France. That explains now that it's interesting to have it in mind. The French have a nuclear power, military power. It costs us about 10 billion euros a year, which is a huge amount for a country which has debts, which has lots of issues in education, healthcare, and all that. Never and nowhere on the political stage in France, in the right-hand side, and on the right parties, in the left parties, you see anyone telling anything against the deterrence and the cost of it. Why? Because in the collective emotional memory, no one wants ever again to have no more France as we had on the 25th of June 1940. Wow. So this is collective emotional memory. And so I made this this detour, and I've lost the thread of my thought.
It's okay.
But anyway, guarantees of security are crucial. Collective emotional memory of Ukrainians, but collective emotional memories of the Russians. So let's try to find out the ways and means to set up a system which could, I would say, guarantee the independence of Ukraine and get rid of the Ukraine issue between China and the European Union.
How do you see what Bill Clinton said to, I believe it was Yeltsin, that NATO would not move an inch to the east? Is that, and I think Bob Gates might have written about it. So did it move to the east, or is the Ukraine war avoidable?
So I remember the time of the fall of the USSR and the fall of the wall of Berlin. I was in Germany at the time when the wall fell, and it was a big surprise. The ones who tell you I knew it would happen, they lie, because no one knew actually at the time. There were lots of unrests in Poland, in Hungary, but the repression by the USSR was such in the past that everyone would think they will calm it down and nothing will happen. In the GDR, it happened, and the wall fell. And I remember at the time, the USSR was totally shaken. And 1991, there was the fall of the USSR, the end of the USSR, and the 15 republics of the USSR fell apart, and each of them became independent, including Ukraine. The idea at the time was we must repair and rebuild the economies of those countries. That was the major priority. No one thought of the security issues. It was totally put aside, and security is something which is needed. That was the time Mr. Baker, Secretary Baker.
Actually, yes, James Baker.
Jim Baker.
Honorary Chairman of Asia Society Houston Center.
And Jim Baker was with his colleagues, and he was the one, actually, who in his memoirs, has written that there was this promise. Foreign Minister Dumas, French one, also wrote it. There is nothing written as such, and there was no commitment by the NATO countries that there wouldn't be 1 inch further to the east. It was never written. These were words said. There is only one document which exists, which I saw by political directors, a meeting of political directors of Germany, the US, UK, and France. And they said, and Russia, and they said, we shall not go further inch beyond the Elbe River. So they said it, but there was no pact, no commitment, no engagement. And for a while, one didn't talk about security, one didn't talk about NATO. In 1997, that was Clinton, that was the first time one spoke of expanding NATO. Some people say that it's the reason why, the reason for it was that Clinton, for his re-election, needed the votes of the Poles in certain states of the US.
Heard of that.
Right or wrong, the truth is that it started from that moment. And I would say step by step, there were more and more countries belonging to NATO. The Russians didn't say at the time anything. It was Yeltsin time. It was the rebuilding. It was a major crisis in the USS in Russia, and so no one was saying anything. But the more the time went, the more things became complicated. Because in 2004, the former 3 Baltic republics of the USSR,
yes,
who had become at the same time member countries of the EU, became member of NATO, and there was the Ukraine issue. And I remember that President Chirac, end of 2006, I was his special diplomatic advisor, told me, Ukraine, there will be a problem. It's complicated. And he asked me to go to Moscow to meet my opposite number, to discuss with him of a plan which could, I would say, work out about Ukraine and the status of Ukraine. And I went with a draft plan to meet this colleague, and the plan was a cross-protection of Ukraine by the NATO on the one side and Russia the other side. Cross-protection. We had at the time the NATO-Russia Council, which was I would say, a subsidiary of NATO. And this status would have been ruled by this Russia-NATO Council. So the Russian colleague read that. His name was Sergei Prihodko, passed away unfortunately. And he read my draft and he said, oh, that's very interesting because it will save our status in Sebastopol. Sebastopol, as you may know, is a major harbor in Crimea, right, on the Black Sea.
Right.
At the time, remember, Crimea was belonging to Ukraine. Since 1954, right, Khrushchev giving it to Ukraine, from
being
Russia to Ukraine.
Ukrainian himself. Absolutely.
But there was a lease for the stationing of a Russian base in Sebastopol. So the Russians were very much fearing that one day, if Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, their naval base on the Black Sea would be totally surrounded
right.
by NATO. So he said, "Oh, it was his first reaction," and I saw immediately that, oh yes, as a Russian, the obsession for the warm sea is there. They want to have this access since Peter the Great, and Catherine II made it. And
and they took it from China, part of it.
Yes. And
1850 some.
Absolutely. And so Prihodko told me, "But did you talk about this project with the Americans?" I said no, because Chirac wanted to see with you whether you would be interested. So it's only a draft. We have to elaborate it. It's very complicated. He said yes, but talk about it. And so I went to Germany because that's the instinctive reflex we have. We must consult the Germans. And the Germans told me, it was 2006. Madame Merkel was in her post of a chancellor since 1 year. So she didn't want to engage. And so the answer was, do ask the Americans. So I went to Washington, and I went and I met with Condoleezza Rice, who had been my interlocutor during the Iraq War.
She is the one that is pushing the East.
And she is pushing, but she's remarkable, I would say, a remarkable woman. The way she's a self-made woman in a way, and so she's remarkable. So I admire her very much. We didn't share anything together, or any opinion. We were in opposite position all the time, in confrontation, but we could discuss. And I went there. I showed it the draft, and I said I was by the Russians, and that's their reaction. How do you react to this idea of a cross protection by NATO one side, Russia the other side? And she laughed, and she said, "But Maurice, what is that? You have tried to prevent the first wave to take place of the countries joining NATO. You will not stop the second wave of countries joining NATO." I remember her words in my ears.
Right.
And from that moment, 2006, we understood that the US wanted Ukraine to be part of NATO. And that was, I think,
so true.
Maybe people say this is the Russian brief. This is the way Russian people present the things. It's part of the reality. There are countries which are by nature between two major ensembles. And so, yes, one says every country has the right to choose its own alliance. But look at countries like Austria. Austria is still neutral. Austria didn't fear any pressure from the East. And so you will tell me there is Sweden, there is Finland. But this is because the invasion in Ukraine. Ukraine had, I would say, a destiny which is to be a buffer country. Ukraine itself means the march, means the frontier in Russian, Ukraina. And so here we are. And so in my view, as long as we shall not have the guarantees of security and to protect the neutrality of Ukraine, and we have Ukraine in the middle of the road, things will be very complicated on the international stage.